The long and challenging life of Moses is rapidly drawing to an end. Moses is about to die, and as you turn to Deuteronomy chapter 29 and verse 10, we ask the question, what is going to happen? In Deuteronomy chapter 29 and verse 10, Moses speaks to the people that are on the brink of heading into the promised land. And he says to them, Deuteronomy 29:10, all of you are standing today before your Lord, your elders, your little ones, your wives, the sojourner. And we ask the question, what is going to happen next? You picture this scene. There's some 600,000 men, and if you were to count the women and the children, perhaps up to 2 million people on the brink of entering into a land where there are giants and armies and fortified cities. What is going to happen? It makes me think of the millions of citizens in Ukraine right now, as we see pictures daily, if not hourly, of women and children and pregnant women, elderly men and women, young men, husbands fighting to protect their families. And we ask the question, what is going to happen? Moses is about to say goodbye to these families. In chapter 31, in verses 1 and 2, we read how he says he's 121 years old, and he's not allowed to enter into the promised land, and he's about to die. Moses, up to this point, has, for the first 28 chapters of the book of Deuteronomy, has given the people careful instruction and passionate admonition and tender encouragement. And it's all come down to this point where he is calling them to action. The time for talking is done, and he is pleading with them, charging with them to make a decision. And if you look at chapter 30 of the book of Deuteronomy, verses 11 through 20, we find a very impassioned invitation, perhaps one that you could put on the top of your list of the great invitations in Scripture. Listen to these beautiful words as Moses calls this next generation of people to action. For this commandment that I command you today is not too hard for you, neither is it far off. It is not in heaven that you should say, who will ascend to heaven for us and bring it to us that we may hear it and do it? Neither is it beyond the sea that you should say, who will go over the sea for us and bring it to us that we may hear it and do it? And so you remember, Moses is about to die. Just picture the last words of a grandfatherly figure or a faithful preacher, and you have one last time to hear him speak, and he's pleading with the people to choose to follow God. He says it's not so far, it's not so high that you can't reach it, it's not across the sea that you can't reach it. He says in verse 14, but the word is very near you, it is in your mouth and in your heart, so that you can do it. Moses is confident that they can make the decision to serve God. Verse 15, see, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil. If you obey the commands of the Lord your God that I command you today, by loving the Lord your God, by walking in his ways, by keeping his commandments and his statutes and his rules, then you shall live and multiply. And the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to take possession of it. God is a gracious God, a good God, a giving God. He wants good things for his people. And as we've seen in our study of Deuteronomy over and over again, Moses is telling them the way to life, that they would be a people that would be set as a treasure among all the nations to show how much God loves them. This is an ultimate decision that they need to make. Verse 17, but if your heart turns away and you will not hear, but are drawn away to worship other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall surely perish. You shall not live long in the land that you are going over the Jordan to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore choose life, that you and your offspring may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying his voice, and holding fast to him, for he is your life and length of days, that you may dwell in the land that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to give them. Maybe right now you are at a crossroads in your life. What is going to happen? You're on the brink of the Jordan River. The promised land is ahead of you. There are storms that await. There are giants in the land. There are fortified cities. There's a wilderness of sin around you. What decision are you going to make? You hear these words of Moses, and we ask you the question, what is in your future? What will happen? Maybe tonight is the night that you need to become a Christian, that you've been taught by your parents. You have been brought by a friend. You know the truth. And if you're at the crossroads tonight, this is a lesson that is aimed for you to respond to. This lesson is for you. What is in your future? Maybe tonight you're at the crossroads and you've already obeyed the gospel and you have stumbled and you've become discouraged, become bitter, you've become angry. You need to be restored. You need to be renewed. This lesson is for you. Listen to the words of Moses as he tells you, choose life or choose death. Maybe you're heading off into high school or into college. You're graduating. You're changing jobs. You're about to get married. You're about to start a family. You're about to retire. And you're going through a time of transition. You're at a crossroads point as a Christian. This lesson is for you. And maybe you are a Christian who, maybe you're at a stage in life where you're like Moses and you have family members, children and grandchildren, loved ones, and you are pleading with them to call them to make this decision. And I want you to listen to Moses' words so you can be like him and encourage and admonish and warn and call people to obey the gospel. This lesson is for you. So we talk about practicing faith in Deuteronomy chapter 29 and 30. We see in chapter 30 this great invitation that Moses gives, and it's based on 3 points that we're going to make as you go back to chapter 29. And those 3 points are, if you can remember these 3 words, that you need to remember, you need to decide, and you need to beware. So making this life-changing commitment to God is based upon these 3 points. So in chapter 29, if you want to mark it down, verses 1 through 9, Moses' appeal is to call them to think about the past and to remember who God is and what God has done for them in the past, and that's going to motivate them to be faithful in the future. And then in verses 10 through 15, we're going to see that there is this call of decisions for them to enter into the covenant. And then in verses 16 through 28, there's going to be a warning about their future so that they would beware about sin and particularly to be aware or to beware against the dangers of secret sin. So it's remembering the past, it's entering in or making the decision to be in the covenant with God in the present, and then being aware or to beware about the dangers of sin in the future. So that's where we're headed in our lesson for this evening. I'd like to thank you for your attention all this week, for the members that you've all been talking about me being tired or weary and being here, but I am refreshed, and my wife and I have been so blessed to be with you. You've treated us very well. You all have been the ones who've been working and teaching and going about your jobs and being here every night, and what an encouragement you are to me, and we're very thankful to be in this gospel effort together with you. And then for those that are visiting, we're so glad to have you, and it's especially good to see the Casimirs here tonight, and we're very thankful for their encouragement to Jennifer and I through our lifetime. Deuteronomy chapter 29, the first point that we're going to look at is that God calls them to remember. So making a decision to be faithful in the future, we find that Moses calls them back to remembering what God has done for them in the past. And a lot of times when we forget what's happened in the past, particularly when we forget about what God has done for us in the past, then that can blind our eyes to the blessings of the present and can rob us of hope about where we're headed in the future. God's past favor helps us face today's trauma and tomorrow's trouble. So as we look at chapter 29 in verses 1 through 9, we're going to find that there are 4 characteristics that are listed for us to learn about who God is and what he's done for us in the past. And so see if you can pull those points out as we look at these verses. Chapter 29 and verse 1. These are the words of the covenant that the Lord commanded Moses to make with the people of Israel in the land of Moab, besides the covenant that he made with them at Horeb. And Moses summoned all Israel and said to them, "You have seen all that the Lord did before your eyes in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his servants and to all his land, the great trials that your eyes saw, the signs and those great wonders." The first thing that Moses brings to their attention is to remind them of what God had done for them before. And he says, your eyes have seen this. And it's interesting as we read this, remember this is the new generation, that those that were of the older generation from 20 and up died in the wilderness, other than Joshua and Caleb and Moses. And so you ask this question, had all of this new generation, had they all seen everything that had taken place in Egypt? And certainly not every one of them had seen them, but God is speaking to the people in a collective sense. So it'd be as if you were to describe the history of America and say, as Americans, we have seen all of these different things take place in our country's history. Or maybe you were to talk about your family and say, your family has seen XYZ in the past, or this congregation has seen all of these things. So there is a communal, unified sense in how God's people have seen all of these things. And one of the things that they saw was the power of God to bring the mighty nation of the Egyptians to their knees. How are they going to be able to face the giants in the future on the other side of the Jordan? They need to remember the great, incomparable power of what God has demonstrated in the past. Is God going to be able to help them in the future? Yes, he is, because of the power that he had demonstrated for them in the past. Not only has God demonstrated his power to them, that if they remember the power of God in the past, that's going to help them in the future. But then if they remember his patience, in verse 5, he says, I have led you 40 years in the wilderness. For 40 years, God demonstrated what would seem to be a long time. We talked about this on Sunday. It'd be like if we started a journey back in 1982 and you've been traveling for 40 years and you're just now finally reaching your destination. How much patience would be involved in that? God has been patient with them, not only for 40 years, but throughout the history of mankind, and God is continually guiding them. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, months turned into years, years turned into decades. 40 years have taken place, and yet God is still patient in taking care of them. And if God's been patient with them in the past, he will be patient with them in the future. And then as you continue reading in verse 5, something else they're remembering is not only God's power, but they're remembering God's patience, but then they're remembering that God has been compassionate in providing for them. It says, I have led you 40 years in the wilderness. Your clothes have not worn out on you, and your sandals have not worn off your feet. God provided for them. He says, you have not eaten bread and have not drunk wine of strong drink, that you may know that I am the Lord your God. They didn't have to plant from the ground to grow their own wheat to be able to make their own bread or plant their own vineyards. God provided for them in the wilderness, and he took care of them. And just as God provided for them in the past, he was going to provide for them in the future. And then finally in this section, not only are they remembering that God was powerful and patient and he provided for them, but then he also protected them, as he did over and over again, not only with the Egyptian army, but with the giants of Sihon and Og in verse 7. And when you came to this place, Sihon the king of Heshbon and Og the king of Bashan came out against us to battle, but we defeated them. We took their land and gave it for an inheritance to the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of the Manassites. Therefore, keep the words of this covenant to do them, that you may prosper in all that you do. So we see in chapter 30, there's this call, this invitation for them to choose to stay faithful as Moses is about to die. And the first thing he says that they need to do to be able to progress forward is to remember the past. The previous generation had eyes to see and ears to hear, but they did not remember God's power, his patience, his provision, and his protection, and they died in the wilderness. And so I want to ask you this question. Do you have eyes to see and ears to hear, or have you been blind and deaf to God's power, his provision, his patience, and his protection in your life today? Even just this past week. Are you consumed with fear, with what's going to happen in the world, as you see what's happening in Europe right now? Are you consumed with anxiety, maybe even anger and bitterness and wrath about what's happening in the political landscape? Are you discouraged and filled with despair as you think about how our world just seems to be getting worse and worse from a moral standpoint? And as you think about the freedoms that we've lost, the freedoms that are being threatened, and you think about what's going to happen to your children and to your grandchildren, are you at the crossroads and you are thinking, there's no hope? And as a result, you need to remember this message. You serve a God of incomparable power. Remember the Great Commission in Matthew chapter 28 and verse 18. Jesus said that he'd been given all authority, all power in heaven and on earth. There is no realm on earth or in the heavenly places where Jesus does not have ultimate power and authority. And he is your king. And because of that power that he's demonstrated throughout his reign, we have nothing to fear. We are not helpless and hopeless. Ephesians chapter 3, verses 20 through 21. Do you believe these passages, or are these just things you remember as a child? That God is exceedingly able to do abundantly above all that we can even ask or think. Are those just platitudes, or do we really believe it? You're standing at the crossroads thinking maybe you should become a Christian, or maybe you're standing at the crossroads and you feel bitter and discouraged and think there's no way that you can be restored. Or maybe as a Christian you're standing at the crossroads and think there's no way we can make a difference in our community to try to grow and to evangelize the lost, and we're just going to maintain the status quo. Or do you recognize, if you remember the past, that you serve a God of incomparable power? And then he's patient. Look at 2 Peter chapter 3 and in verse 9. Maybe you think, I know that God's powerful, but his power is not for me. I know that God is powerful and he will protect and he will help others, but I'm too sinful. I've made too many mistakes in the past. And as a result, God will not, I don't deserve the protection of God. I don't deserve God's care. But we read in 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 9 about the long-suffering of God, that God has not returned yet because he is long-suffering and patient, and he doesn't want anyone to perish, and that includes you. That includes you, and that includes your neighbors, and that includes the wicked people of this world, that God is being patient. Our steps of where we're to go in the future are dependent upon our willingness to walk with God in the future as we're facing this crossroads is largely dependent upon this first point. If we really remember God's power, we remember that God is patient with us. Isaiah chapter 30 is such a beautiful passage. Isaiah 30 and verse 18, we read about the patience of God, and it says, therefore the Lord waits to be gracious to you. When was the last time somebody was waiting to be kind and gracious to you, even in a situation where they have been taken for granted? I just think about how as God's people, we have neglected God and taken him for granted and sinned against him. And God would have every reason to give up on us. And God's not in heaven with his back turned and just I can't wait to see when you stumble, and then I'm going to punish you. God, the Lord waits to be gracious to you. Therefore, he exalts himself to show mercy to you. How is God different from all others? He is exalted and set apart and glorious and holy, and what sets him apart is his graciousness. how he is different from you and I because of his kindness and his patience. The Lord is a God of justice. Blessed are all those who wait for him. God is waiting for us if we would just simply wait for him. God is a God of power, a God of patience, a God of provision. Yet we are tempted over and over again in this physical world to look at things from a worldly perspective, to be overcome with worry. And Jesus addresses that in Matthew chapter 6, verses 31 through 34, about not worrying about what you're going to eat, not going to worry about what's happening with your food and your clothes, and how we can be worried about all the things that are happening in our political world, our physical world, worried about money and wealth and retirement in the future. And Jesus tells us that if we were to seek him first and his righteousness, that God will take care of us and all things will be added to us. Do you believe that? That God is a God of provision, and that when we ask and we seek, that he will provide, that we as parents know how to give good gifts to our children, Matthew 7 through 11. Don't we understand that God will provide for us and that God will protect us? Look at 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8. We just often feel like we're on the run, running away from Satan as if he has the upper hand and we're afraid. But in 1 Peter chapter 5 and in verse 6, humble yourselves therefore under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary the devil prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Resist him, firm in the faith, knowing that the same kinds of suffering are being experienced by your brotherhood throughout the world. And after you have suffered for a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. To him be the dominion forever and ever. And then a parallel passage, James chapter 4 and verse 7, submit to God, resist the devil, and he will flee. Are you seeing but not seeing? And are you hearing and not hearing? Or are you at the crossroads this evening and you need to listen to this message? The first thing we need to do is to remember who our God is. His power, his patience, his provision, and his protection. Let's turn back to our text in Deuteronomy chapter 29. And the second point that Moses has built this invitation upon is not only do you remember God's past favor, but then he describes about this covenant that they're entering into. Now they're entering into this older covenant, the covenant, the Torah, and we enter into a different covenant, but we can learn some principles. Look at verse 10. You are standing today, all of you, before the Lord your God, the heads of your tribes, your elders, your officers, all the men of Israel, your little ones, your wives, and the sojourner who is in your camp, from the one who chops your wood to the one who draws your water, so that you may enter into the sworn covenant of the Lord your God, which the Lord your God is making with you today, that he may establish you today as his people, that he may be your God, as he promised you, and as he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. It is not with you alone that I am making this sworn covenant, but with whoever is standing here with us today before the Lord our God, and with whoever is not here with us today. So put yourself in the mindset that there are giants in the land, fortified cities, strong armies, and here is a gathering of people with wives and children and little ones, and all the people are there. And God is saying, enter into a covenant, an alliance, enter into this covenant agreement with me, and I will protect you. How many times have you heard President Zelensky pleading for help? And it was just within a couple days after the Russian invasion. Remember how he sent off an application to be a part of the European Union, right? Why is he doing that? He's wanting help from his European ally nations. And then there's NATO. You think of all those things, just imagine that Satan's army is surrounding us and he's trying to destroy us, our wives and our children. And then suddenly we have this opportunity to go into some divine union, this alliance with God, to be a part not of some man-made alliance with military might from a human perspective, but to have fiery chariots in the heavens surrounding us, protected by the Lord of hosts. Why would you turn that down? Or could you imagine somebody in Ukraine and there's 40 miles of tanks that are just headed your way, and somebody in Ukraine say, oh no, I'm going to be fine on my own. I don't need protection from a higher power or from some army. Or if you had some of your members run in here and say there's a threat outside, and they start passing out bulletproof vests. I mean, we would be scared at one point, but then on the other hand, you would be thankful that you have protection. From a spiritual perspective, you see that God is saying there is danger that is out there, but enter into this covenant with me and I will protect you. God is offering us this protection. This is a decision that is so easy for you to make. Notice that it's a personal decision. He says there in verse 10, you are standing today. So I'm not talking about your parents. Say, sure, maybe today you haven't decided to become a Christian, or maybe you are a Christian and you've fallen away, and you say, well, I'm mad at my parents. I'm mad at my grandparents. Or I'm mad about some brethren at a different church that they treated me wrong. Or I'm mad because I saw hypocrisy in the church. And I'm just blaming everybody else. God is talking to you. You are standing here today, and I'm inviting you into this covenant. It's a personal decision that you have to make. And you're not going to be able to stand on the day of judgment and blame other people. Or you're not going to be able to stand in front of God on the day of judgment, or Jesus on the day of judgment, and just expect to receive blessing just because you had good parents and good grandparents and were a part of a good, faithful church, and just expect that other people's faithfulness were going to be able to enable you to enter into heaven. It's a personal decision to enter into this covenant. It's an immediate decision. How many times did we read in verses 10 through 15 the word today? This is today. You need to make this decision. We already read in chapter 30 too. In chapter 30 also, the urgency of this decision that they were to make, and that it's for everyone. It is something that God is allowing others to be a part of, and you see that in chapter 29, verses 10 through 15 for all the people in their society, and then today especially for Jew and Gentile alike, God invites us all to enter into this covenant. How often did President Zelensky, when you do hear him talk, is he asking for immediate help? Say, shut down our airspace today. Send us missile defense javelins today. Satan is attacking us relentlessly and is so much more worse than anything from a physical perspective. And we need to respond today. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 18, there is military language that's used in the New Testament to wake us up to realize the danger of the situation that you're in. 1 Thessalonians 5:18, but let us who are of the day be sober, putting on the breastplate of faith and love, and as a helmet the hope of salvation. Are you going out against Satan's army unprotected? 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 2, now is the day of salvation. Moses, speaking confidently, is telling the people, you can have life if you remember the power, protection, provision, patience of God, and you can have life if you today take the personal responsibility to make your decision to enter into a covenant with God. And then finally, he warns them. The first point dealt with the past. The second point dealt with their present. And now it's very interesting. It's kind of a side shift where he starts looking at what's going to happen in their future. And I'm just going to read the text back in Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 16, as we look at our last point here. You know how we lived in the land of Egypt, how we came through the midst of the nations through which you passed, and you have seen their detestable things, their idols of wood and stone and silver and gold, which were among them. Beware. Beware lest there be among you a man or a woman or clan or tribe whose heart is turning away today from the Lord our God to go and serve the gods of these nations. So as he's appealing to the people, he's even anticipating, he's giving this warning, saying, there may be some among you, it may be one person, it may be a family, it may be a whole tribe, but you are thinking about the wickedness, the idolatry, the sinfulness of the nations that you came out of, back what you saw in Egypt. And as you go into these Canaanite lands, you may be following after or tempted to follow after the sin in the land in which you're going. And he says, beware. Beware lest there be among you a root bearing poisonous and bitter fruit. So twice in verse 18 is this warning of beware about this future sin. Verse 19, one who, when he hears the words of this sworn covenant, blesses himself in his heart, saying, I shall be safe, though I walk in the stubbornness of my heart. This will lead to the sweeping away of moist and dry alike. The Lord will not be willing to forgive him, but rather the anger of the Lord and his jealousy will smoke against that man, and the curses written in this book will settle upon him, and the Lord will blot out his name from under heaven, and the Lord will single him out from all the tribes of Israel for calamity, in accordance with all the curses of the covenant written in this book of the law. And the next generation, your children who rise up after you, and the foreigner who comes in from a far land will say, when they see the afflictions of that land and the sickness with which the Lord has made it sick, the whole land burned out with brimstone and salt, nothing sown and nothing growing, where no plant can sprout, an overthrow like that of Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, which the Lord overthrew in his anger and wrath. All the nations will say, why has the Lord done thus to this land? What caused the heat of this great anger? And the people will say, it is because they abandoned the covenant of the Lord and the God of their fathers, which he made with them when he brought them out of the land of Egypt, and went and served other gods and worshipped them, gods whom they had not known and whom he had not allotted to them. Therefore the anger of the Lord was kindled against this land, bringing upon it all the curses written in this book. And the Lord uprooted them from their land in anger and fury and great wrath, and cast them into another land as they are this day. So it's interesting. Moses is there's so much beauty and opportunity that is in front of them. Remember God's power and what he's done for you. Enter into this covenant. But there's somebody here who's saying in their heart, they've deceived themselves into thinking, you know, I can serve idolatry. I can serve myself. I can reject God. And I can go through the motions and have the outside appear like everything's okay. And I'm going to tell myself in my heart, I will be safe. He's warning them against secret sin. He's describing the path of the apostate. And we think that this would never, surely this won't happen to God's people. And we think about the same thing for us, don't we? This would never happen to God's people. This would never happen to my children. This would never happen to my parents. This would never happen to my friends or my favorite preacher or to the deacons or to the elders. And surely it would never happen to me. You see this warning over and over again in the book of Deuteronomy. In chapter 27 and verse 15, there's a warning about secretly worshiping idols. Chapter 27 and verse 24, he talks about someone who secretly hits his neighbor and abuses other people. And in chapter 28 and verse 57, it talks about things would get so bad that some would secretly eat their own children when times were bad. Secret transgression was not unknown during the time of Noah. It wasn't unknown. Secret sin was not unknown during the time of the kings. And secret transgression didn't end during our times as well. And so there are three things that we need to look at as we can see this, as we conclude with this third point about how God warns us about the danger of secret sin. The danger of secret sin, we need to remember that we can all be guilty of it, it impacts three groups of people. It impacts yourself, it impacts others, and it impacts God. You remember the statement when you talk about deceiving yourself that somebody said sin will take you farther than you want to go, it will keep you longer than you want to stay, and it will cost you more than you want to pay. The secret transgressor, according to Deuteronomy chapter 29, thinks that there'll be no consequence, or thinks that no one will know or no one will see. They think that it will be fine. I can do this without fear. I will be safe, though I persist in my own way. But Galatians chapter 6 and verse 7 warns us, do not be deceived. God is not mocked. If we sow unto the flesh, we will reap corruption. We can't fool God. We can deceive ourselves. It's like you put on a mask, you look into a mirror, or you put on a mask, and you pretend to go about living a life in front of others that is false. Secret sin deceives yourself, and it also hurts other people. Secret transgressors fail to realize that by sinning, that they are hurting others. Notice that verse 18 talks about this root that bears poisonous and bitter fruit. A root grows underground and is not easily seen, but it spreads, and it is a source of propagation that spreads fruit that, according to this text, is poisonous and bitter and brings destruction to your family and to your brethren and to others, and it reproduces danger. It's as if you were to say, I can blow through a town, a hurricane or a tornado, and I can be selective, and it's not going to randomly impact everybody. Or to think that you can shoot a shotgun into a crowd and not hit anybody, or a ballistic missile. It creates havoc everywhere. You are lying to yourself. You are hurting your brethren, your friends, and others. And most importantly, you are grieving God. God sees it all. And how foolish it is. It's like the child, we've all seen it in our children, where they put their head under a box and they think they're hiding and that we can't see them. Or I heard of a story of a child that would go downstairs and do something he wasn't supposed to do, and it found out that there was a picture of his grandma and his grandpa, and he scratched out the eyes of his grandparents in the picture, thinking that meant that nobody saw what he was doing. Some of the Lord's best work, some of the Lord's best churches, best families have all been destroyed by secret sin. When we think about the eyes of the Lord, look at Psalm 139. God sees everything, and that should not be something that terrifies us in fear that makes us want to run from God, but in fact, our hearts should be comforted by the fact that God sees us and that is aware, that He cares for us. And we see that message of comfort in Psalm 139, beginning in verse 1. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You hem me in behind and before. You lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high. I cannot attain it. We should not be running from God, because we can't run from God. We should not be fearful of God's knowledge of us. In fact, we should be comforted because of God's knowledge of us, as it should submit us into humbly serving Him. Verse 7, where shall I go from your spirit? Where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night. Even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is bright as the day, for darkness is light with you. We return to Moses' final plea in Deuteronomy chapter 30. And Moses says to the people, remember, decide, and beware. And in this, he offers this invitation Tonight, are you at the crossroads? Is tonight the night that you need to become a child of God? We'd go to the New Testament under a new covenant, a better covenant that the book of Hebrews tells us about, with a perfect high priest, with a perfect blood, a perfect sacrifice. Jesus says, he that believes and is baptized will be saved. Will you believe that Jesus is that perfect sacrifice, that lamb that died, bearing your consequences so that you could find forgiveness of sin? Will you repent of your sins, and will you enter into his body through the blood that he shed by becoming a Christian, by being baptized? And you say, I can't do this, not me, because I'm too sinful or I don't understand it. It's too complicated. I choose to remain ignorant. Deuteronomy 30, verse 11, this commandment that I command you today is not too hard for you. It's not too hard for you to make that decision right now. If you understand who Jesus is, that you've committed sin, that you can become a child of the Father. It is not too hard for you. It is neither is it far off. It is not in heaven that you should say, who will ascend to heaven for us and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it. Neither is it beyond the sea that you should say, who will go over the sea for us and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it. But the word is very near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart, so that you can do it. What is in your mouth and in your heart tonight? Will you become a child of God? Will you choose life? You may say, no, it's not me. I can't be forgiven. But in chapter 30 and in verse 4, even after God's people, even God knew that they would go into sin and be taken into captivity. In verse 4, look at what God says. If your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there the Lord your God will gather you. God says, I will bring you back. God is ready, waiting to show grace to you, to bring you back home. And you may say, no, not me. I can't win in the end. Yes, you can, because you serve a God of power who is triumphant and will protect you. Will you enter into a covenant with him? Will you become a child of God? Listen to the words of Moses if he were today speaking this final appeal to you to make the decision to become a child of God. If you are a Christian, you've been wayward, come back into the family of God. And if you are a Christian who is faithful, renew within yourself the courage to take the gospel message to the lost, because they need to hear this message. Listen to these words of Moses. Won't you respond to the Lord's invitation? Won't you come as we stand and as we sing?